Jim Bowie project is a curation of 50 knives from some of the top bladesmiths in the world to all build the same pattern of knife, but do it in their own unique style. Unfortunately, it doesn't look like those teeth stuck together very well at all, and it started to come apart basically as soon as I started forging in the area where my tang is going to be on the knife. Howdy and welcome back to the workshop. In today's episode, we're starting on billet number 3 for the Jim Bowie project, which is something I talked about in the last episode. Quick shout out to today's sponsor, which is Athletic Greens. We'll talk more about them later on. For now, let's start stacking up some 1080 and 15N20 steel and get this billet stuck together. I've got a fun, different Damascus pattern planned than the one that I messed up yesterday. So let's jump on in. These pieces are 6 inches long. I'm gonna have 27 layers of steel, and I'll start by stacking them up properly. It's a heavy on the 1080 billet, which means that the final result will be a darker billet of Damascus. The 1080 is the dark steel and the 15N20 is the light steel. I wanna have 1080 on the outside of my billet so that as the steel starts to swell and grow with the heat, the thicker 1/8 inch thick pieces won't grow quite as much and won't distort quite as badly as the 15N20 does, and it'll give me a better chance of having a good forge weld on the outside of my billet. So with this steel stacked up, MIG welded along the outside, it's time to throw it in the forge, let it come up to about 2200 degrees Fahrenheit, and throw it underneath the 1924 400-pound Bowie mechanical forging hammer. With my steel stuck together, it's time to forge it down into square bar. I'm gonna bring it down to 700 thousandths of an inch. It's right between 3/4 and 5/8 of an inch. There's no way to tell what it would be in millimeters, since obviously that whole system doesn't make any sense. The reason why I'm forging it down to 700 thou specifically is that it fits inside the medium-sized dies that I have for my twisting machine. Once it's forged down into square bar, I want 6 6-inch long pieces. I chop it up by hot cutting it. That way I don't have to wait for it to cool down. I can throw it right back in the forge and get to twisting. I'm gonna do 3 bars right hand twist and 3 bars left hand twist. This means that when I stack them up side by side in my final billet, I'll have an interesting herringbone pattern. Now after my bars are twisted, I want to forge it back down and take it back from where it was, which is essentially a round bar, back down to square, and I want some crisp edges on there so that I have less material to grind off to get it ready for the next step. So I programmed into my press, I wanted it down to 600 thousandths of an inch, and that leaves me with a nice, still beefy bar while still giving me those crisp corners that I was after. Now today's episode is sponsored by Athletic Greens and their product AG1. AG1 is a daily nutritional supplement that you drink. It is a green drink. It doesn't really taste like a green drink though, it tastes good. It has, to me, sort of a sweet, kind of almost coconutty flavor. It's definitely sweeter than the black coffee that I'm used to drinking, and so it's not something you have to choke down. I actually really enjoy it. Now, one of the things that I really appreciate about AG1 is that it's so dang easy to take. You just put a scoop of it in the shaker bottle. I like to do it in the morning before I've even had my first cup of coffee. Throw it in, shake it up, drink it down, and you have all sorts of benefits like a better immune system, better hormone regulation, healthier aging, and more energy. Now it's nice and simple. It's just 1 scoop in the bottle or 1 travel packet and 8 ounces of water. Now it's also vegan, keto, and paleo friendly, which is just a cool thing. It's nice that there's not any ground up animals in here. So if you're interested in an easy to use and tasty way to get into supplements, go ahead and go to athleticgreens.com/Will Stelter for a free 1-year supply of vitamin D and 5 free travel packets so you can see how it tastes, see how easy it is. Thank you, Athletic Greens, for sponsoring today's episode. With that, let's get back to Bowie knife making, shall we? So now that we've got our twisted bars forged out, I want to talk about what the plan is for the pattern. So regular multi-bar, believe it or not, is a billet of Damascus made up of multiple bars. So if you're going to look at it in a very simple way, it would look something like this. That would be 3 bars, you got 1, 2, 3 bars. This is a pattern molding technique that's been used for literally over 1,000 years, which is quite cool. But I want to do something a little bit different. I've done similar stuff in the past, but nothing quite like this. For one thing, I don't want my twisted bars to be touching each other. If you were to do a bar like this, you'd probably have 2 bars of left hand twist, 1 bar of right hand twist, and so you kind of get this herringbone effect running up the blade. You can also do 2 bars of right hand, 1 bar of left hand, it's whatever. But I want to separate out my right and left hand bars with thin strips of 15N20, and the reason why I want to do that is because it's going to show off the next thing that I want to do in the process a little bit better, which is to cut chunks out of my bar like so. We will have 6 bars, by the way, and not 3. And so if I have this kind of squiggly line like that. When I flatten it down then, my bar is gonna look like that, with bright strips of 15 and 20 running in between it, and then some cool patterning effects going on in the rest of it. So I cut down my 15 and 20 strips to fit in between there. I ended up making them a little bit thinner, not on purpose, it was by accident, but I knew I was gonna grind it away anyway, and so it doesn't really matter if they're a 1/16 of an inch thinner than the bars. Once I got the sides of my bars cleaned off, I MIG welded it all together and threw it in the forge. Now I did end up adding some flux to the outside of the billet while it was heating up, just because it's a very exposed forge weld. After that, I utilized the full length of the Bowie dies to get good full contact along the width of the bars, all in one hit. That's one of the really big advantages of having long dies like that. It's just a joy to be able to set forge welds underneath them. After that forge weld was set, while it was still at full thickness, I cut out a V shape from the end of the billet that allows me to then forge weld those ends back together. That means that my pattern will flow a lot nicer towards the end of the billet in the final shape, rather than kind of running off the edge. All of the bars will come back together and the lines of 15 and 20 will meet, and it just looks a lot nicer than just letting those bars either get forged into a tip and distort a ton, or just to have them run off the end of the billet. Both of those look very unintentional, and this is a nice way to have a good ending to the billet, and it's also a historic technique. With the fish mouth weld set, I ground my billet clean again. I got ready to cut out the portions that will allow me to serpentine this billet. I didn't want to go too deep into it, and so I laid out all of my lines, cut it out with the bandsaw, and then smoothed out all of my curves on the belt grinder. With those curves cut out, it was easy enough to flatten down the billet with a hand hammer on the anvil before moving on to forging the shape of my knife. Now I made a steel template that I'd be able to check against my forging to make sure that I had enough room to grind into the exact profile. This shape turned out to be a real challenge to forge. There's lots of curves. The double harpoon clip on the back turned out to be quite challenging as well. Thankfully I still had enough steel left, and so I was able, with about 3.5 to 4 hours of forging, to, under the little giant and with the hand hammer, get it forged very close to shape. The only area where I had a little bit of extra meat was pretty much right there on the tip of the knife, where I forged it out a little long under the hammer originally. Overall, I'm very happy with how the shape came out, even though it took quite a while to get it where I needed it to be. With the final shape on there, I traced out my shape onto the blade with a much finer pattern than the steel one, ground to a loose profile so I still had a little bit of meat to grind in on. I did this at full thickness. I hadn't ground any scale off of the sides. That means that I'm a lot less likely to get warping, and it means that I only have to deal with one layer of decarb from the steel being at high temperatures. After that, it was back to the angle grinder and the belt sander to get this thing cleaned up and have a look at our pattern. After getting it to about 120 grit on the belt sander, it was time to go in for a quick etch in ferric chloride. Well, I am just thrilled with how this thing came out. The 15 and 20 lines in there really make you understand the serpentining that happened to the billet. I'm really happy with that. It's a little bit more jagged of lines than I kind of expected. It's wild to see how much movement those bars had to have gone from smooth flowing lines into, there's some pretty sharp, pretty small tweaks in those lines, which really surprised me. I think it's cool to see the activity there. I feel like you can definitely see that it's been forged to shape. And I'm really excited to get to add some cool grinds and a cool handle onto this guy to finish off this project. Stay tuned for that. It's going to be a wild handle and just a wild project in general. Thank you a ton to AG1 for sponsoring today's episode. Thank you patrons for patronizing me. And with that, I will see you guys on the next one. Bye-bye.